Father Sirico, one of the funny things about you is that you used to march for Cesar Chavez.
Now you're telling my confession publicly. I was going to change the world, bring about justice.
California produced one of the greatest priests in America who speaks against socialism. You cannot make this up.
If I came to religion through anything, it was through economics. Milton Friedman, Friedrich Bastiat, Ayn Rand. I didn't have answers to the questions. I don't say in my book on the parables that Jesus was teaching economics. What I say is he's speaking about things and even about ancient technology that we're still familiar with today. Mm-hmm. The story the parable tells, it's the accusation of the Marxist to the capitalist.
They are trying to break e pluribus unum, divide.
That's the whole point of Marxism is class struggle, because they think that human nature is manipulable, and it's not.
Father Sirico, it's so great to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
You know, thank God for good friends. Thank God. One of the funny things about you is that you used to march for Cesar Chavez, and you partied a little bit, maybe with Jane Fonda.
I did, yes.
And so I think that people...
Well, of course, now you're telling my confession publicly.
Well, this is it. This is it. There's nothing like bringing a priest on your show and having him confess and explain. But what an amazing story you have. I'd love for you to share it.
Well, it begins in Brooklyn, New York, in a working-class Italian home. I'm a very typical Italian home at the time. We didn't know we were poor, but we were. There were 6 of us in a little apartment on Coney Island Avenue in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. And that was the era of the ethnicity of Brooklyn is really an incredible place, because I went to the high school that Isaac Asimov, I'm sorry, not the high school, the grade school that Isaac Asimov went to. When my brother and my sister and my other brother were there, Woody Allen went there and his sister. So they knew them just as kids in the neighborhood. And as I grew up, well, let me tell you the story of my neighbor, because I think it's really formative for me. It really helped me to have a sensitivity toward human vulnerability and injustice. And that was Mrs. Schneider, who lived right across from us in an apartment. So we had apartments where you could look into each other's. This was all before the invention of privacy, right? Mm. So I was at my windowsill. This memory is I was about 5 years old, and I watched Mrs. Schneider. She lived there with her husband. She was rolling out some dough, and she had a bowl. She was making arugula. I imagine the majority of your viewership will know immediately.
If they don't, they should learn
look it
what
up.
it is.
Look it up.
It's very yummy.
Addictive. So she's making arugula, and I was watching her, and she'd lay it out and roll it and put it in the Wedgwood oven and go back and make some more. And pretty soon I could smell the aroma wafting from her kitchen to my kitchen. I was mesmerized by the whole process. During this whole thing, Mrs. Schneider never looked up. She just kept doing. Then when she was pulling the last tray out of the oven, she put it on the windowsill and she looked directly at me. She said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." And so I scampered over my windowsill and I presented my hands to her, and she put a napkin over my hands and she began to place the warm arugula in the napkins. And as she did this, I noticed that running up her arm were a series of blue tattooed numbers. Now, I had never seen that before at 5 years old in Brooklyn, but I came to see it many, many other times. A lot of my friends of my age, their parents had gone through the Holocaust. So I went back into my kitchen, hid the arugula from my siblings. My mom came into the kitchen. I said, "Why does Mrs. Schneider have numbers on her arm?" And my mother sat down. My mother had no great education or anything, but she taught me a very profound lesson that day. She said, "You know when you watch the cowboy movies on Saturday morning?" "Yeah." "And they capture the calves?" "Yeah." She said, "What do they do to the calves when they catch them?" I said, "Well, they lasso them and they tie them up." She said, "Then what do they do?" I said, "They brand them." And she said, "Why did they brand them?" And I said, "Well, that's because so everybody will know who owns that calf." She said, that's what people did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider and her whole family. So you have to be very respectful and patient with Mr. Schneider because he was a little mashugana. You know, he would yell at you and stuff like that. And I was horrified. I mean, intuitively, innately, it was a horrifying thought that this kind lady would be treated like that. And what that did was form the way I looked at a lot of, this is the 50s and then going into the 60s, a lot of the social change movements, the protests in the South and things like this. So I had an affinity for that. And unfortunately, I wasn't well enough tutored. No one in my family went to university. I was the first one to go to university. So I was easy prey by the time my early 20s came around. This is now the 1970s. And my socialist friends who I was in association with really kind of encouraged this activism. And that's when I met, different people like Jane Fonda and on the streets of Hollywood, for the most part, protests. And if there was a picket line, I was picketing. And if there was a sit-in, I was sitting. And sometimes 2 and 3 a day we would engage in. I just had a little job. There was no ambition to go to college at the time. And so I was this activist. I was going to change the world, bring about justice. And I suppose, even though it wasn't explicit in my mind at the time, that experience with Mrs. Schneider is what made me sensitive to this kind of stuff. And one day I was visiting a friend's apartment, and he had a friend over. I think I was bringing picket signs. For some reason, there's picket signs in my head and the trunk of my car. Those are things. So it must have been I was bringing them from the trunk or I was putting things into the trunk. Anyway, his friend was there, and we walked out to my car in Hollywood, one of these little studio apartments that he had out there. And as I'm putting the things in the car, I see the car in front of me that had a bunch of conservative bumper stickers on it. And my friend and his friend were standing there, and I began to mock these bumper stickers. And this guy said, oh, that's interesting. He said, that's my car. I said, oh, yeah. And so, I'm from Brooklyn. If you want to be my friend, we have to start with an argument, right? Yeah. And we began to talk, and he began to give me books to read. Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom was one of those books.
Economics.
Well, it was all economics. And interestingly enough, it was all secular. So these were not religious. Milton Friedman, Friedrich Bastiat, Ayn Rand, a whole bunch of these kinds of books, Ludwig von Mises. And I began to read them, and then we had conversations, and I didn't have answers to the questions he was asking. I made these assertions, and he would always ask me, what does that mean? Define that. What do you mean by fascism? What do you mean by private property? What do you mean by expropriating the wealth and redistributing the wealth? And I knew these phrases and I had a vague idea of what they meant, but he would then draw out the consequences. If you take away all of the wealth of the wealthiest people in the world and redistribute it, what are people going to do the next day? And I said, well, they go to work. He said, oh, do they? He said, where? I said, well, they go to jobs. He said, where are the jobs? I said, well, what do you mean? I honestly, it's embarrassing for me to say this now, having been involved with economics for 35 years, 40 years, that I didn't know the answer to this.
Were you a religious man at the point where you were living in Hollywood?
No. I had really abandoned religion at this time. I was involved with some progressive churches that were involved in activism. But once I met this guy, he really pushed me also on the God question, because even though he was a conservative, he wasn't a believer. And it was a very interesting and energetic intellectual period to exchange ideas and to have these constant battles, which we enjoyed together. He was a lapsed Mormon.
And so it was different from your experience at a progressive church where you would go and they would teach you about socialism and victim
there was
mentality.
only one. Yeah, it was whole victim mentality. This was woke before woke. In those days when I was involved with that activism, we used the term politically correct seriously. Now people think it's a term of the right, but it wasn't. It's really a term of the left. If you don't follow the doctrine, then you're politically incorrect. That's what it was. So there's an orthodoxy to the Marxist thinking. And as I read these things, the light went on in the room slowly. And I went back to my friends, my leftist friends, and asked them questions. And they just said, don't listen to that guy because he's just a right-winger. He's a fascist. And they would name him. And then I would say, well, define fascism. Pretty soon I just kind of left the left. I mean, there's a lot more to this story, and I will write it someday as an autobiography. But that resulted in my coming to understand the importance of ideas, college, learning sequentially, building on your knowledge, reason. And as I did all of this, without explicit reference to religion, even though it was in the back of my mind because I had gone through catechism class when I was a kid, and a little bit of yeshiva because all my friends were making their bar mitzvah around the same time, it began to dawn on me that I'd heard these things before in my life about reason, about human dignity, about freedom. And it was what I'd known in catechism. And so Thomas Aquinas, I mean, we didn't use that name. Maybe I had heard the name St. Thomas Aquinas, but I didn't know what he had written or said. And finally, in the middle of a real struggle over God in my own mind, some priest came to my house. A friend said, oh, there's a guy, his name is Sirico. He's an Italian. He's probably Catholic, but this priest just wanted to see Southern California. So could you show it to me? I said, sure, I'll show it to you. But this was at the very right moment. He happened to be a philosopher. And I asked him some questions about God. And he cut through it like a hot knife through butter. And then I said, I'd like to go to confession. We sat down at a table very much about the size of this one, a marble table in my kitchen. And I said, would you hear my confession? And he was shocked. I mean, he was here just to see the city. And he wasn't a pastor. He was a philosopher. He was an academician, a Jesuit too, at that. And he looked at his watch when I said, no, I'll make it concise. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 13 years since my last confession. And then I just told him everything I'd been up to and that I was tired of and that it didn't make sense and it didn't engender life in me or peace in my heart. And I came back to my faith. And I came back to it in a bumpy way because I didn't know anybody in the church at the time. I just would go to Mass and come home. But I had some good foundation, I realized then, when I was a kid. So I would go to confession on a regular basis, and then I went to university. And then the whole intellectual infrastructure began to fit in place for me.
Well, I underestimated how amazing the story is because...
Oh, and I haven't told it all because this is television.
Here, California produced one of the greatest priests in America who speaks against socialism, promotes capitalism. You cannot make this up.
No, I guess not. Yeah, you would expect that, right?
Yeah, it sounds like an anti-Hollywood story. Speaking of it, your brother was a real gangster.
He was. So this is the same environment. He's 10 years my senior. Oh. And he largely grew up on the streets. So by the time I came into the family, he was already out there hustling and busting chops, as we say in Brooklynese.
It's Paulie from The Sopranos, right?
Paulie from The Sopranos, yeah.
Yes.
But he got himself in trouble as a kid. I don't know how many times he was arrested for various little things. And then as we grew older and I was now living on this coast, he had to go to trial for some serious things and was sentenced and spent time in Sing Sing. I remember I went up to Sing Sing with my mother to see him at one point. While he was in Sing Sing, and I should also mention that he was never a made man. he was always on the periphery. There are rumors that he was a made man, that he killed somebody. Those are just all rumors. He was watching, when he was in Sing Sing, a theatrical troupe came and did a performance of something. And he said, that's what I want to do. I want to play a gangster. I don't want to be a gangster. And he got out and he began to do that. And he moved out here for a while. I remember seeing him when I was at university. He was living, and there's just so many little stories I could tell about that. But he began to do movies, and it was bit parts, and then he did commercials. He was on Starsky and Hutch. He was on, what was the show with Telly Savalas?
Well, somebody here is going to have to help me with that one.
That's right. You're too young. I'm sorry. But all these different shows that he was on. And then some of his big breaks came later, and this is by the time I was either in seminary or a priest, with Goodfellas. He was in Godfather 2, but they cut out most of his part. He had just one little part, and if I showed you the part, I could point out
People
my brother.
Remember him.
No, he's very memorable.
Yeah.
And then he got the Sopranos part,
yeah.
and that was incredible.
Yeah. What did your parents think about this combination of a priest and a gangster in one household?
I don't think it was a surprise to them. I mean, it wasn't like it was all happening, so it wasn't like you stood back. My brother reflected on that once when he introduced me for the 20th anniversary of the Acton Institute. I should say, too, that my brother was more conservative than me. He may not have been as well-read as I am, but his gut was very, very almost reactionary. He said at this introduction, he said, it's funny how life imitates art. And he referred to the James Cagney movie, Angels with Dirty Faces, where James Cagney becomes a gangster and Pat O'Brien becomes a priest.
Yeah.
And there we were. And we had a very good relationship. I was on the set of The Sopranos. I even advised on some of the scripts of The Sopranos when they were showing Catholicism. And I was asked this, I don't think I've said this on television before. I was asked to be in The Sopranos, to play a priest.
And?
I declined.
Why?
Because I said, my brother's the actor, I'm the priest. And interestingly enough, I'll tell this because it's just a charming story. When my mom died, a lot of the cast members, his friends, came, including James Gandolfini. And he came to pay his respects. And he said, now, tell me something, because I heard this, and I want to see if it's true. He said, referring to the creator of The Sopranos, David Chase, he said, did David offer you a part on The Sopranos? I said, yeah. He said, did you turn it down? I said, yeah. He said, people were lined up to have a cameo role. Why did you turn it down? I said, he wasn't paying enough.
You learned something in Brooklyn.
Right. So, yeah, that was a very interesting period. And then he was a believer, but not a practicer. In a way, he practiced the faith in his charitable works, for Wounded Warriors and St. Jude's Hospital and things like that. I described him once as being like a loaf of Italian bread, hard on the outside and soft on the inside. And but at the end of his life, I was finally privileged to hear his confession and restore him to the church. And he died 2 weeks later. And then I did the funeral in Brooklyn.
You shared the story of a formative experience in your childhood, the story of meeting the Holocaust survivor.
Mrs. Schneider.
And I think about how you tell the story of the instinct that you had of compassion, that human instinct of wanting to understand why evil can happen. And I think about the experience that so many young people are having now growing up on social media and the internet, where I don't know that human instinct of compassion is becoming more tone deaf because of the type of exposure that young people are getting to, frankly, evil. And I know so much of the work that you do is focused on not just bringing goodness to the world, but actually bringing goodness and virtue to children through education. Do you ever think about that? How do we scaffold virtue for young Americans?
Well, what's very instructive on this, and I think you've really hit it on the head, the diminishment of compassion in society, and what that really is a regression to a pre-Judeo-Christian ethic. It's the ethic of the pagans. And this information I give you comes from, major historians, Tom Holland, for example, who wrote Dominion and Pax. And he's, to my knowledge, is not a believer, but he believes that it is the Jewish Christian faith, and in an institutional way, the Christian faith, that introduces this notion of compassion institutionally into society and begins to erode the viciousness of the pagan world that didn't care about human life, that would, could throw people away if they didn't, expose their children, abort their children, divorce and reject people and any vulnerability. But that it was this notion of the Judeo-Christian ethic that founded the hospital, that institutionalized care for people, that founds institutionalized and internationalized charity, and not because you believe what I believe, but because I believe what I believe.
It rejected tribalism.
Exactly. A kind of more universal vision. And I think what we're seeing in part with now I'm going to sound like an old man, young people today, but certain cultural tendencies at the moment is this kind of viciousness, this cruelty. You see it in the way people argue with one another. It's not a kind of Bill Buckley argumentation with whoever on firing line. It is ad hominem. It lacks reason. It is afraid of reason. You look at much of the transgender debate. Where's the debate? It's just screaming. There's no, well, let's sit down and define our terms. I mean, there's a Supreme Court justice sitting on the Supreme Court right now who refused to define woman. And she's a woman, and she's going to make legislation or court rulings that affect this. So I think this is a whole thing about reason, about the lack of compassion in society, and what we have to do to combat this. Certainly we need political remedies to these things, obviously. But the primary concern should not be the election cycle. It has to be the formation of minds and souls. It's more than education. It's more than dropping information into kids' heads. You can get that from Google. It is forming hearts and forming minds and having families that make demands on kids and teach them the virtue of prudence, of patience, of how to learn how to tolerate boredom. How are you going to read a big book if you can't tolerate boredom? And so it's all of these things that are very needed and that we're losing in our society, in large part because of the temptation of the technology. But I don't think it's just that. I think it has very much to do, now I put my economic hat on, with the presumption of the Great Society programs and the New Deal that began to take out of the community the religious action to help the poor. It used to be that virtually all of the programs to help the poor, whether it was schools or orphanage or hospitals or care centers, that these were all primarily religious institutions. The state would come in occasionally to help boost the whole thing, but this came out of some kind of religious intuition. And that when the state took over these things, in the name of justice, always in the name of good intentions, it pushed to the margins the religious communities, weakening the religious communities, but also weakening the fabric of society itself. And so you have this coarseness now and this demand not so much for compassion, but for legislation. And I think that is a great deal of the problem culturally in society. We no longer know how to disagree civilly with one another.
the word compassion can be misused so many times, right? Like your background, you had compassion and you became a left-wing socialist activist until you realized, well, there is compassion in a certain way, and then there is completely being irresponsible in the way that we're seeing the state of California behaving in the name of compassion, which really I think is no coincidence that I'm sitting with a priest with questions about the chaos that we're experiencing in our society, right? We talk about how when God created the world, the first thing God did was actually organize the world, right? And here we are sitting 250 years after our country was founded, and we're experiencing this unbelievable chaos in our society. And the chaos, surprisingly to me, is not just on the left, right? So for many years, I've been running PragerU for 15 years now. I've been talking about how the left is a force of chaos. It can't distinguish between a male and a female. The very basics of society where a child is not an adult. A child is not going to make the decisions that an adult can make, right? Left-wing chaos. With that said, I can't sit idly by and not notice that there's also chaos on the right. So I used to think, well, if at least we send our kids to a Catholic school and they learn the Ten Commandments and they learn the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they learn these things, they will be somewhat inoculated, maybe immune against the type of chaos that, frankly, we're now also seeing on the right. And I can give you many examples of the chaos that people of my generation and younger are experiencing and witnessing, even within our own tent. So I've been thinking about this term tent, and of course, what came to my mind was Bill Buckley, right? Bill Buckley would try to create some order to this chaos. And so I didn't know who to call except for you to explain to me, how do we wrestle through this new form of chaos within the right, within Christianity, an area where I didn't expect to find it. Now it's becoming a growing problem, I would say.
You said a lot there, and there's so much I'd like to add to. I think you're absolutely right. On the theological, cosmological level, God does speak order because he speaks reason. In the Christian revelation, the passage that complements so beautifully Genesis 1 is John chapter 1, which speaks of the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that the God of the Jewish and Christian faiths is a God of reason. In fact, he institutes it. That's what the creation of the world is. And we've lost that. We've lost that even in Catholic schools, in parochial schools, in part because of this tendency to socialize everything, to put it at the behest of the government. In terms of education, it's Dewey's system that really built an educational system designed for material corporate production, without reference to God, quite explicitly, not implicitly. He wasn't neglecting God. He was rejecting God, Dewey. And a lot of the Catholic schools and the private parochial schools adopted that model, rejecting the classical model, which was much more about forming the character in addition to the mind. And so this is where we're in this dilemma right now. With regard to this very sensitive topic of the retrieval of anti-Semitic tropes and the viciousness that has existed, and the anti-Semitism explicitly that has existed within Catholicism, and in particular in traditional circles. Let me first put my credentials on the line here. I am a priest who celebrates both forms of the Mass. I celebrate the Latin Mass on a regular basis in my parish. I'm an Orthodox Catholic priest. I believe in all the teachings of the Church, even those that are uncomfortable for me to live from time to time. But that's what the law of God is. It makes us uncomfortable, and that's a good thing. So having said that, there is in the history of Catholicism a tension between the Jewish idea or the Jewish community and the Christian community. It should come as no shock to you that I believe Jesus is the Messiah. It should come as no shock to me that you don't. and that begins a conversation. I mean, how do we resolve this? We either resolve it by fighting with one another, or we resolve it by talking with one another, by dialoguing with one another. From an authoritative view, from the Catholic traditional point of view, a council of the Church has pronounced in its document Nostra Aetate that anti-Semitism is completely unacceptable, that replacement theology is unacceptable, that what we believe is that we are siblings to one another, that Christianity cannot be Christianity without Judaism. It's absurd to think that it could be. In fact, one of the earliest heresies of the Church, the first person to try to canonize the New Testament, was a man by the name of Marcion. He was a priest. And he was the first one. This is in the late first, early second century. He began to compile the Gospels and some of the letters from Paul, but he edited them. And what did he edit out of the Gospels and from Paul? All reference to the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, why would he do that? Marcion was what we call a Gnostic. Gnostics believe that the material world is intrinsically evil, and that the only thing that is good is the kind of disembodied world, that there's a demigod and there's the eternal God who is fully spiritual. Christianity, like Judaism before it, rejects that notion. Believes that the world is good, that God made the world, that God
for us
to
live in.
He puts us in the garden, not in a jungle. In a garden, he puts us so that we will tend the garden. We work. The first calling to the human family is a vocation to work, enterprise.
And to enjoy the fruits of the work.
Exactly. To be able to keep the fruits of your labor and to enjoy the fruits of labor and to share the fruits of labor. So Marcion does this, and the Church immediately rejects Marcion's notion because it says, no, wait a minute. The Blessed Mother was Jewish. She was a Jewish mother. Jesus was Jewish. Everyone who wrote the New Testament were all Jews. And we can't understand Christianity without understanding Jewishness. So that this notion, this retrieval, pulls from Christianity those remnants of this earlier heresy. It states truths. Heresy is not only error, it is a truth gone mad. That's what G.K. Chesterton called it, a truth gone mad. So the truth is that Jesus Christ is Lord. He's King of the universe. Where it goes mad is where you have to then think you need to build a theocracy. And the truth is that Jesus is the Messiah, according to the Christian revelation. Where it goes mad is where it rejects the people of the covenant, the people to whom God entrusted.
It's so interesting that you use that term because so many people have come to me and said, well, what's going on? It just feels like people are going crazy.
Yeah.
They're saying crazy things.
They are.
I mean, just intuitively, people don't have the background that you have, but they're getting a sense that something crazy is going on.
Oh, yeah. It's obvious it's going on. I mean, and some, without naming names, although I could, some very obviously and publicly going crazy and getting clicks for it, earning money for it. This is where the technology, when it's not guided by reason, is deleterious. So what do we do when we see people publicly disintegrating psychologically? At what point does it end?
Well, what do you think one should do about this? Because on the one hand, there is the concept of loyalty to our friends.
Yes.
Right? The other, we talk about virtue. We talk about teaching virtue. We teach loyalty. On another note, there is, not everybody has to get involved in everybody's fight. Another note is that people are going to do crazy things, but why pay attention to the crazy? Let's just pay attention to the good. And so how would you, as a moral guide, instruct us on what to do? Because, Father, I think really what is missing is we've lost so many important, heavy intellectuals, starting from Bill Buckley back then, but it continues to happen. And we know that our politicians are not our intellectual leaders. We don't look at them for that.
And we should stop looking at it. They only become that way as a result of a vacuum. The process that I talked about where the New Deal and the Great Society were places politicians as the prime leaders in society. No, the politicians are not. It really should be the pastors. It should be the philosophers.
Yes.
And we're called to do that. Now, the tension here is, because you're right, you pointed to a few things where prudence comes into play. I am not going to have a knockdown, drag-out argument with friends at a dinner party over, unless they're particularly belligerent, and then I'll have it out. I let little slights go all the time. I hear things here and there. So it's not a matter of intolerance. It is a matter of speaking the truth, because the most loving and loyal thing I can do with a friend is to speak the truth. Now, I don't always speak the truth immediately or directly or as bluntly as a New Yorker might prefer to do it, because we think bluntness is clarity. So if a friend has put on a good deal of weight, I might not hector them about losing weight, or if they're smoking, I might, state to them what, but if they think they can blow smoke in my face, then that's going to be, the truth is going to be presented to them. So, but in terms of the movement that we're describing, where a lot of our young people who don't have the formation, because a lot of them have come into the movement through the realm of politics. And politics is a very different thing, especially modern politics. It used to be a philosophical, intellectual engagement. Less and less now are we guided, or our politicians guided. And I'm talking here now about the right as well, guided by principles. There are right-wing collectivists. In fact, the similarity between the socialist stuff programmatically and the right-wing stuff programmatically is very similar. It's just this group of people want to take over the government for these ends, and these people want to take over the government for these ends. But they're both failing to recognize that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That what we want to do is not have the power, but disseminate the power, dilute the power so that it's not concentrated in one entity, one Politburo. The people, I had a debate with someone who would be considered on the right, who was making these pro-statist notions. And I said, you want to create the Politburo because you think you're going to be on it.
Yeah.
And you're not. You're going to be one of the first to go. So especially if you're religious, I mean, this notion that there are religious leftists, I mean, serious religious leftists, not just poetic, Unitarians who pray to whom it may concern. But I'm talking about serious religious thinkers who defend the left. They're going to be the first to go. I mean, after they're done with us.
Of course. Of course. It is such an interesting point that you made, that many of these people have come to religion, allegedly, through politics.
Yeah.
And I think it's very astute, because many of especially if you're talking about, let's say, podcasters or social media influencers, their focus has first been politics and galvanizing a populist movement, and then they became religious, and then they speak on behalf of religious people. In your case, you also came to religion through politics, because first you discovered the magic of the free market, and then you came to religion. And so how were you able to align yourself with the good that comes with that political awakening, and not necessarily the greed and the bad that comes with the political awakening?
Well, I would offer this corrective. I didn't come to religion through politics. If I came to religion through anything, it was through economics.
Yes.
Which is different. Economics is human action. Politics are an after effect, and then you could debate the right or wrong of it. But I started with a set of principles of how to think about human action and moral responsibility and the dignity of other human beings, all of these things. Politics has always been marginal to my thinking, and it should be marginalized. It has a role, it has an important role, but it does not have the central role. The family has to be the central organizing and restricting authority. And then the culture also restricts people's authority. Robert Nesbitt says that there are two forms of constraint, the power and authority. Authority is a form of constraint that is interior. It's when you buy the norm that is set by tradition or religion, and you conform your behavior to that norm because you believe in it. Power is a form of constraint as well. This is Nesbitt. But it is external. It is political. It is coercive. And because it is that, it can never be as radical as authority. And what I'm saying is that all of the just and right and empathetic, compassionate goals of socialism can be better, or what they profess to be, can be better achieved by this interior radical conversion that goes on in a person's mind to love our neighbor as we love ourselves.
I want to talk a little bit about your book because it was so much fun to read.
Thank you.
And especially for me, I don't have a background in the parables, but to see how you really turn the table upside down on leftists who claim that if you are compassionate and if you love your neighbor and if you want to take care of people and if you in fact follow the gospel, then you have to be a socialist leftist, right? And you proved through two books that in fact the opposite is true.
Yeah.
That Jesus would have taught us to actually be free market lovers. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to say it. I tend to stay in the philosophical and ethical realm and understand that markets are subjective way of evaluating things, and theology is an objective way of doing it. So there's virtue, not just good conduct, but virtue, something much more radical. But yes, I tried to offer a corrective, but to do it in a way that was true to the parables themselves. I don't say in my book on the parables that Jesus was teaching economics. It would be anomalous to say that Jesus, because economics didn't exist as an intellectual discipline at the time of Jesus. That comes later. Through theologians, by the way, but that's another question. So what I say is when Jesus, a parable, by the way, is literally means standing side by side. So it's when Jesus says, and by the way, the parabolic mode of teaching is certainly not Christian. It's Jewish.
Yeah.
And it's different than kind of the pagan notions of legends and things like that, because these are rooted in real life. And what Jesus says is the kingdom of God may be likened unto, and then he fills in the blank by talking about something that you know in your life, whether it's a field, whether it's a relationship with your brother, whether it's an inheritance, whether it's a legal battle, whether it's hiring or firing people, paying people, all these things that we all know from human action. I mean, you think about these parables, it's very interesting that he's speaking about things and even about ancient technology that we're still familiar with today. I don't think it'd be hard to create a parable that will last 100 years based on the iPhone.
Yeah.
But when you talk about hiring laborers for a vineyard or finding a pearl of great price, this is stuff people can
totally relevant so many years later. Yeah, that really is the power of the Bible, how timeless it is. You shared some of the parables, and it made me think about even the story of Joseph, right? So the story of Joseph, he gets sold into Egypt.
Yes.
And he's able to interpret dreams, right? And so there is a basic economic lesson. Now, I'm sure he didn't think about it in terms of basic economics, but he interprets this dream about the cows, right? You have the cows that are fat, and then you have 7 years, and then the cows that are super skinny and emaciated. And so then, based on that interpretation, he's able to go to Pharaoh and say, you need to save up. You're going to get ready. You're going to save up. You can't spend every dollar that you bring in and spend out immediately, which is very relevant to today. I think
sounds
we
like
can
the
think of
description
Gen
of
Zers.
the market.
Yes, right?
What the market's doing today.
Exactly, a total description of that. And then you explain the connection between the parable of the talents, which I absolutely love. And so I want people to buy your book, but I think that if they hear the story, maybe they'll be even more inspired to see your wisdom there.
Well, to try and put it concisely, the story of the parable of talents is of a man who owned a lot of wealth and goes on a journey. And he says to 3 servants, I'm going to entrust you with my talents. By the way, the word talent that we use today is a unit of measure, an economic unit in the first century. And he goes to these 3 men, and it begins by saying he entrusts to each according to their ability. That's a very important part of this thing, and you can just forget it by the time you get to the end of the story. But that's very important that he knew who he was giving these talents to, and the talents were enormously expensive. These were about $1 million each. He gives 1 5, 1 2, 1 1. He goes away, he comes back. The one who has 5 has produced 5 more. He says, well done. Now I'll give you responsibility over more. You've proved yourself. The one who has 2 has 2 more. Great, I'll give you more responsibility. The one who has 1, this is very interesting because what he says sounds so modern, and it sounds particularly familiar to my ears, having been on the left. Because when he comes to the man with the 1, he says to him, I buried your talent. Now, in Jewish custom, burying a talent was not a bad thing. It may sound that way to a modern ear, but it was a protective thing.
Saving.
It was saving. It was preserving it from vandals and thieves and all things. So he takes out the talent. So that wasn't his problem, that he hid the talent. It's that he was not productive with the talent. And why wasn't he productive with the talent? Because it required risk. And here's what he says to the master. This is the whole thing. He said, I knew that you are a cruel man, gathering where you have not scattered, and collecting what you have not sown, harvesting what you have not sown. And so I hid your talent. Now, what does that sound like to you? Who gathers what they haven't scattered?
The government.
No. It's the accusation of the Marxist to the capitalist, right? You're an exploiter. You are making money off of my labor. You're taking something that I have and claiming it as your own. That's really, now I'm not saying that Jesus was aware of Marx and all of that. What I'm saying is that kind of logic, that kind of way of thinking, it's the human condition. And he says, this man who entrusts him with a talent is seen at the beginning of this parable as generous and entrusting to you something. Now, through this man's eyes, you are cruel.
Right.
You gather where you have not scattered. You gather where you have not sown.
It's the warning of conspiracy and fear.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yes.
Because if he looked at this person who gave him the talent as an investor, he would have been grateful.
Exactly. And he would have had more responsibility. That would have been his payback.
Right.
But no, he comes at it the way Marx comes at it, the way modern socialists come at it and say, capitalists are exploiters. You gather where you have not scattered. It's not you who have produced this.
Right. And so when you have that conspiracy and fear and you're not grateful,
right,
you fall into this victim mentality and then you can't produce for yourself.
Right.
So interesting. How do you explain the laborers in the vineyard? I can really relate to that because I'm a CEO.
Oh, yes. And you know, when you have great opportunities, you have to hire more people to help you to harvest those opportunities. That's
Yes.
exactly what this man does.
Yeah.
He goes out into the workforce, and at the beginning of the day and mid-morning and midday, and then even at the end of the day goes out. And each time he says to them something very interesting. He says, come and work in my vineyard and I'll give you the usual daily wage. Now, at the beginning of this parable, these people think, gee, I got a job. Thank goodness. And I'm getting the usual wage. They go to work. Then it comes down to the end, and he hires them. Well, what are you guys doing sitting around? Nobody hired us. Well, get into my field, because obviously this guy had a vineyard that needed a lot of tending. A lot of harvesting needed to be done. And the later workers were as important as the earlier workers, because this would be all lost. The produce would be lost if they didn't bring it in before the weather changed or the season changed, whatever it happened to be. And then, of course, the story is he begins to pay them. And he reverses the order of their payment. So he starts with those who are hired last. And he gives them a penny, it's called, or it's the usual daily wage. They're thrilled, you know. And then it goes through all of them to the end. And the guys at the end are saying, oh, well, if he's given all of them who have not worked the whole day the usual daily wage, we're going to get more because we work the whole day. Now, there's a sense in which I have empathy for them. I mean, they have worked the whole day. They were paid what they were promised, and they resented it. Nothing has changed in terms of the agreement. The only thing that has changed is their perception, how they see the situation. But this man, and he says to them quite explicitly, this is why it's very uncomfortable for a liberation theologian or a religious socialist to read this passage, because here's what this man says directly. He said, I have not done you any injustice. Have I not paid you what we agreed upon? He said, am I not free to do what I want with my property? He says then at the end, he says, or are you envious because I am generous? He recognizes that these men got more than they expected, but he pays everyone justly. Justice is treatment in accord with desert. Now, if you want to do something over and above the generosity, he did it to these men who were paid more. But of course, it's an instructive document, so it's not an economic document. Nonetheless, it tells us something about the reality of I think the economic mistake that the people who worked first had is, I'm sorry to say it again, the Marxist mistake. The economic theory that the amount of labor you put into something constitutes the price of the thing it is. That's not what it is. The price of this cup is only what you
It's what people are willing to pay.
Exactly. So it's not even the capitalist that sets the price.
Right.
It's the consumer who sets the price.
Yeah.
And that's why you have reductions of price, because they miscalculated. They thought this was going to be more popular as an item. And people think, well, I put so much more work into this. You should value this more. I mean, any number of us have things in our homes that are heirlooms or things that have charmed us that charm no one else. And we would give our life for this thing, but nobody's going to give us 2 bits for it. So that teaches us that it's not an objective amount of money. It's a subjective understanding of economy.
So many lessons from this parable. I mean, one is that the person who runs the business needs to be able to decide how to run their business, right? So we saw over the last few years ESG, right? The environmentally, socially governed type of agenda that the left has come up with. And the socially governed piece of this is the idea that everybody gets to make a decision about how to run your business. And we know that that doesn't work. You can't have socially governed. And so this is the perfect example of that. And the other perfect example is that, like you said, it's not necessarily the amount of hours in the day that you invest into something. Oftentimes it's your capacity, your capability, what you come with, your experience. And so, when people will look at their next door neighbor and say, well, or their colleague and say, why is that person making more money than me? We're working the same number of hours.
Right.
Well, because they bring in something different to the table. And ultimately, the person who runs the company needs to be able to discern and have that decision making.
Exactly.
But I would say even more so than any economic lessons that we can take from this parable is the lesson about human nature. The greed and the envy, the looking at the other person to blame and to want what they have. I mean, straight out of the 10 Commandments, right? The do not covet, which nobody seems to be immune to. This is the age-old problem where you just want to find somebody to blame for your own deficiencies.
Yeah, I think we all tend to do that. We want to blame other people rather than saying, okay, well, I didn't fit. This job didn't fit for me, or I didn't produce as much, or whatever it happens to be. The broader question, too, is what prices are. What do prices do? Why do prices need to be free? That is unregulated. And that is because prices communicate information. The price of a given thing tells you how much it took to produce it, the relative supply of the resources to make it, and the relative demand that it has in a market. So if you obfuscate the information that comes from free prices, what you do is you make all of us dumber. We don't know then what we're doing. And when you do that in a society overall, what you have is economic dislocation. I give you the Soviet Union. I give you virtually any socialist economy where they overproduce one thing and underproduce another because they don't have prices. And there are some people now, I think, sitting in Congress who are calling for the abolition of money. What would you do? I think they tried that in Cuba for a short period of time at one point. If you don't have some mechanism to communicate the information of what reality is, what exists to be able to produce this, how much it costs to transfer it, design it, market it, all the rest of it, you're flying blind. And that's what goes on, and why private. One of the reasons private property is so important.
Father, there's oftentimes a debate whether liking nice things is okay or is it sinful. And I'm curious, what is your take on it? Because if I read your book, you don't seem to be against liking nice things. I read that Jesus Christ very likely wore an expensive garment, which he received.
Yes.
And so when we talk about capitalism, people will oftentimes say, well, capitalism, that is greed. You shouldn't want nice things. You should want modesty. What's your take on it?
Well, I think you can have modesty and nice things at the same time. I mean, the question isn't the material, as though the material world is itself evil. That's the Gnostic error. It's that how you attach yourself to them. I mean, I came to an awareness that I wasn't really a socialist because one day when we were out picketing, a whole day of picketing, we came back. We were all tired, and we sat in my apartment. And I remember people were on the floor and on the couch and stuff. It was very Hollywood 1970s.
I can totally picture it.
Right. And we used to talk like this. What do we want when the revolution comes? And so everybody went around the room. When the revolution comes, we want justice, we want racial equality, we want equality for women in society, all these different things. And it came to me, and I said, when the revolution comes, we'll all be able to shop at Gucci's. And everyone was quiet and stunned, and the smoke stood still in the room. And I'm not going to tell you what kind of smoke it was in the 1970s in Hollywood. And I said, what's the matter? I said, we're working for a world that is going to be materially better for everybody. And I'm just using Gucci's as a metaphor for that. And my friend who was leaning on the couch next to me, she's my favorite friend. I called her a lesbitarian Trotskyite. She said she really was
She
an
wins
Orthodox
victim
Marxist.
bingo?
Yeah. She was an Orthodox Marxist. And she said, Robert, I don't think you're a socialist. And I said, why? She said, because you're bourgeois. And it was so confusing to me because I thought, what's wrong with, appreciating good quality things, whether it's food or wine or furniture. Yeah. Now, it's different if you're addicted to those things, if they're more important than people, if you exploit people to attain those things, but or accumulate and get your definition from material things. No, but the existence of bourgeois culture in this sense, that is, culture that enhances life, I don't see it as immoral.
Yeah. It's the perfect example of why God put Adam and Eve in a garden.
To work
and enjoy the fruits of their labor.
Yes. And remember the description of the ark, the meticulous description of how the ark was to be configured and the gold that was to be used and the artistry that was required to produce it. And the garment, which you referred to earlier, the seamless garment, which was like a Brooks Brothers, no, not even Brooks Brothers, a Savile Row suit in its day. Of course, it doesn't stop Jesus from wearing it to the cross.
Yeah, it's so interesting because Marxism worships ugliness.
Yeah.
And if you look at Marxist countries and the type of buildings that they build versus you look at a Catholic church, right? Yeah. The beauty. Yeah. And one could say that it's indulgence, but I think it's actually enjoying beauty and the fruits of our labor.
Well, beauty is one of the things that reveals God to us.
This is a really hard question, and I'm sure that you've thought about a lot. And it is about how involved do you think religious leaders should be in politics? So you can have on one side of it, religious leaders should not preach politics from the pulpit, and they should preach religion. And then you have on the other side of it, I think of James Dobson, who passed away, who said, well, you can't detach entirely from life, and politics is life, and we need people with religious understanding and religious leadership to make sure that we maintain the Christian DNA of our country. And so pulling out Christian leaders entirely from public life has maybe cost us the chaos that we're seeing now. Where do we find the balance?
Yeah, I have a different perspective on some of this than Jim Dobson, who I knew and appreciated the work that he did. And this doesn't so much apply to Dr. Dobson as many religious leaders say, because I think since Dobson, he may have set it up in a way, but even before him, Falwell and Robertson, that really was where the evangelicals began to get involved in political life. I think there are distinctions to be made here. I think I can be vibrantly involved in public life, in civic life, without being a politician. I think I gave a speech once, and it was enthusiastic speech, and people were really receptive. And one man got up, and it was all this stuff about diminishing the size of government and taxation and regulation, all the rest of it. And he got up and he said, Father Sirico, why don't you run for president? I said, I have a higher vocation.
Yeah.
And I think that it is a diminishment of our role as pastors. Now, I know I'm going to have, because especially Protestants, some Protestants have a different ecclesiology to my own. They would disagree with me, and we can have that disagreement.
Yes, this is fine.
I'm glad to.
Well, thank God we're still in the United States of America where we can do these things.
But let's use words.
Yes.
So I would say that my call is to affect social life by affecting people's hearts and even institutions, to build institutions that affect that. But I don't need to be a politician, and I think I'm better off not being a politician to do that. I think there is a role for politicians, but I think it has to be a limited role. I think the function of the state is to help society, not to dominate and lead society. The normative way in which society grows and is helped is through the family and through mediating institutions, through individuals formed in a moral sensibility that take care of one another. To the extent that we diminish that by increasing the role of the state, increasing the role of the politician, who are now seen as very powerful culture leaders, what they can do is not form culture, they destroy culture. I think the culture has to come from the cultus. That's where it comes from, the agreed upon beliefs. And you'd be surprised by that. I don't mean a church that dominates or a religion that dominates society in the form of theocracy or an integralism, these various forms of religious governance of society. I don't think that. I think it's a set of principles that people agree with. I mean, I grew up in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world, and we did not agree with one another on our religion, our culture, our culinary appetites. I've often said, for the longest time, I didn't know I wasn't Jewish, but I knew our kitchen smelled differently, So, and yet there was a cohesive ethic that bound us to one another. And that was the dignity of life, the importance of the family, the primacy of the family, and charity in various forms, that we would take care of people in the neighborhood or support causes that were important to us. I remember once when I was a little kid, a friend of mine at the time, this must have been in the late 50s, he had these little books he had to go, they looked like raffle tickets, and he had to sell a certain amount of them. And we want to go play baseball or something. And I said, well, what is it? I said, I'll help you sell them. And they were to plant a tree in Israel.
Oh, yes.
They were this little, it was like white paper with blue writing on it or something. Anyway, and you give the ticket. And I'm on Coney Island Avenue, and there's this little babushka coming down with her cart from shopping. And I said, Miss, would you like to plant a tree in Israel? She says, what are you talking about? I said, here, it's, 25 cents or something like that. Buy a tree, Israel. She said, but you're not Jewish. I said, yeah, I'm Jewish. Buy a tree. No, you're not Jewish. I said, yeah, I am. But and she said, what's your name? I said, Sirikovitz. And she busted out laughing. She said, give me, I'll buy the whole book.
I love it.
But that's to illustrate that there was this shared.
Yeah, e pluribus unum.
Yes, exactly.
That's what it
genius
was.
of the American founding.
Yeah, it's what is so important that multiculturalism doesn't tear us apart. It's why it's so important that we truly see each other as siblings, right? When you talk about when you talk about Marxists, what they're trying to do is they are trying to break e pluribus unum.
Divide. That's the whole point of Marxism is class struggle, class division, class warfare. You have to create the revolution in order to make the perfect
and then come in anew with something else, a new political movement.
Because they think that human nature is manipulable, and it's not.
Yeah.
It is a given.
We talked a lot about virtue and what people need to learn and civic life. We can't ignore the important work that you've done through the Acton Institute. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and also how can we support your work through the Acton Institute?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Well, the Acton Institute was founded out of my own experience of understanding that the essential claim of socialism is moral. It's saying we care for the vulnerable. But my understanding was that they're going about it the wrong way. The socialists said, Marx and Engels said that there was early socialism in Christianity, in the Acts of the Apostles where they held all things common. Winston Churchill responded to that by saying the socialism of the early church said all that is mine is yours. The socialism of today says all that is yours is mine. And what the Acton Institute is trying to do is show that coercion doesn't work as a tool for building community, that if we're going to have fraternal relations with one another, that has to be chosen. And what we do is teach the formers of the moral consensus, the basic principles, and the ethical underpinning of a free economy, to root it in the Judeo-Christian, in the scriptures, the sanctity of private property, which is commanded, thou shalt not steal, as an affirmation of private property, and to help the most leveraged future leaders to inform their constituencies. So now that's seminarians of all denominations, it's podcasters and influencers and professors and rabbis and priests and nuns and all of the rest of it, ministers, missionaries, because, it's not enough to have just good intentions for people. You have to think about what you're doing. If you want to serve the poor, you have to know how to build factories that produce food. And so what Acton does through seminars, through videos, we have a number of award-winning documentaries that we've produced on Jimmy Lai, on entrepreneurship, on poverty, and rigorous academic journals and other things. So they can get in touch with us, your viewers can get in touch with us by going to acton.org. You will see a plethora of information. It's just a whole warehouse of arguments and ideas. And really, PragerU and the Acton Institute, we really are, I think we both see the importance of influencing people's minds and influencing the influencers. Yeah. And so that's what we do, and we welcome people of all. I'm Catholic. I've talked a lot about Catholicism today. But it is not a Catholic organization. It's not a creedal organization. It's an organization to respect the traditions that people who come to us and to promote those ideas in order to build a free and virtuous society.
You've also done amazing work in education with classical education.
Yes.
I keep saying classical education is the hottest thing right now.
It is. It really is.
There's a huge growing movement amongst parents, especially our followers who are interested in it. They're somewhat intimidated. They don't know how to step into it.
Yeah.
Just any quick recommendation for those who want to understand why classical education is the hottest thing and how can they get more into it?
Well, this is through another institute I founded when I retired from the Acton Institute. Retired. I'm the president emeritus of the Acton Institute. But this promotes, and this came out of my school that when I was a pastor. I've always been a pastor and a public intellectual. So I had a day job and another job. And this, what I saw happen in our school very organically, very naturally, when we shifted from the Dewey model of education where the parents were kind of pushed to the margins. We really don't want the parents in here because we know what we're doing. When we changed that model, when we made demands of students and saw our role not as dumping data into their heads, but informing their souls and their minds. So a very important part, in addition to reading the great classics, in addition to memorizing and, education at certain levels. So at one level, it's memorization. At another level, it's taking in data. And another level, expressing it and arguing for it. This is the classical model of education. What began happening in our school was an explosion. And we welcomed parents. And a lot of homeschooling parents came. And they helped create the environment so that our school went from, in a period of about 10 years, went from 68 kids to today about 400 kids in the school.
Is this in Michigan?
This is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it transformed the whole parish. So the parish grew. And,
of course.
And this is not an elite. I mean, our kids learn Latin from kindergarten. We also created a high school, the first Catholic high school in Michigan in 50 years. We opened. It's not an elite school. We struggle to, help the families support their kids in education. From that, we founded the Newman Institute, which is named after Cardinal Newman, who wrote a great classic on the idea of a university, a whole theory of education, which is antithetical. It's a beautiful expression of classical education, antithetical to Dewey. And through the Newman Institute, we help families and schools that want to come to this model of seeing this thing. If I were to put it on a bumper sticker, classical education wants to form the whole person, not just deposit information and make people utilitarian creatures, but to be whole, to recognize the good, the good, the true, and the beautiful in society, and the integrated nature of all reality, so that we can teach ethics from looking at a leaf. We can teach science from studying music. All of these things to bring together the unity of the human person.
You explained so well, quickly, what a classical education looks like. Can you briefly summarize, from your perspective, what is Catholicism? On one foot, as we say.
I think it begins with the reality that we exist, as physical beings who have something transcendent about us. And in this sense, it is an echo of the Old Testament, where God forms the dust from the dust of the earth, the human person, and breathes into him the breath of life. And the man is a composite of earth and heaven. And what Catholicism does is follow that line of Judaism, because the Jews are our elder brothers, as we say in the documents of the Second Vatican Council. It continues that, and because of this incarnational appreciation, this importance of the earth and heaven together, it appreciates culture, institutions, literature, liturgy, prayer, because that's the part of us that is transcendent. And what happens in the Christian revelation is the reiteration of the promise in Genesis that the world is good and belongs to God. And it does this through the incarnation of God's Son in the person of Jesus Christ. This is very important to understand, that Jesus is not a being from outer space who lives among us, but one who comes forth from us. And this, by the way, reiterates what I said about the importance of being a Jew, because he was a particular person who was born in a particular time of a particular woman in a particular place.
Chosen by God.
Chosen by God. And that this incarnation sets in motion a whole view of civilization as having the great potential to bring men and women to the truth of who they are, how they were created, and the God who made them, wanting to bring them back. So in our theology, in our sacraments, in our understanding of literature, our appreciation for the dignity of human life, our understanding of the human person as an embodied spirit, not just a physical being who has an angel inside of him, but this is what we are, spirit and flesh. This is the core of Catholicism. Everything else in our theology flows from this notion that God became one with us in the person of Christ in Bethlehem.
What an amazing antidote to the things that scare parents now vis-a-vis social media and AI and chaos and all the things that we talked about. It really comes across to me like it's a God-given antidote, as if God predicted that we might be dealing with these things and gave us a recipe to navigate through it, as if.
I think in the end, and who knows how much disaster will be in the wake of these moments, I think in the end, truth triumphs because it's stubborn. You can't annihilate it. And it's incumbent upon us to not see the truth as something that is hard, but something that is loving, to tell people the truth about themselves is not a dismissal of the dignity of the person. It's an enhancement and an undergirding of who the human person is. So what I always say is we have to be ruthless with the truth and gentle with people.
Thank you, Father Sirico. It's been a great pleasure. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you. Thank you.